This is the Life with Grief podcast, the podcast that talks about and normalizes the complexities of grief, life after loss, and all this entails, and so much more. I want you to think of this podcast as a safe space where I'm a friendly face and we're just journeying through this together to figure out how to live life with our grief in tow. I'm your host, Tara Accardo. I'm a grief and transformational life coach, and I'm here to serve you guidance, support, tangible coping tools, inspiration, and some laughs along the way to help you cultivate a more meaningful, intentional, and beautiful life. But grieving or not, we're getting into countless topics here on the podcast, from coping with loss to self-development and so much more. I'm so grateful you're here. Let's dive right in. Hi guys, really quick before I bring in Shay, I just wanted to mention this is part 3 of our Busting Common Grief Myths mini-series, and today we're going to be talking about the following myths. I need to be strong for my family, the first year is the hardest, and all grief is the same. This is the crux of the conversation. I am so excited to finish this series off on a really powerful, strong note, but I also just wanted to make sure that you knew part 1 and part 2 are also available for you to listen to. We wanted to make this as bite-sized and digestible for you guys as possible. So if you haven't checked out part 1 and part 2 yet, part 1 is episode number 46. There we cover the myths of everything happens for a reason, time heals all wounds, there are 5 stages of grief, and your loved one wouldn't want you to be sad. And in part 2, which is episode 51, we cover there is a right and wrong way to grieve, I'm strange for needing help, I shouldn't be happy while grieving, and I need to get back to normal. So if you are interested in any of those topics, make sure you check out part 1 and part 2. And without further ado, let's get into part 3. Hi guys, welcome back to this special little series all about grief myths. We are back with Shay Wingate for the next iteration of these grief myth topics, and I am really excited to get into these today because these, I think today specifically, are, in my opinion, some highly common misconceptions and thoughts that can come up in our grief journey. So with Shay's expertise and as a fellow griever herself, I think these are going to be really impactful for you today. And also, by the way, if you are listening to this series, whatever order you're listening to it in, and whether something hits home for you, or maybe somebody you know that is journeying through grief or whatever, please do share this. I think, we've talked about this in previous myths and an episode, but the more grief literate we can get, the more we can share this, the more we can normalize it and talk about it, the better. So that is very much also a goal of talking about all of these with this series. So, but once again, if you are just tuning into this series, or if you're listening a little out of order, which is totally fine, this all stemmed from Shay's mini series on grief myths, which you can learn all about through the link in the show description. And Shay, feel free to jump in if you want to say anything more about that really quick. But without further ado, just want to get right into it. So Shay, welcome back once again. And thank you so much for digging into all of this griefiness with us.
Yes. Thank you so much for having me back. And like you said, people can jump in at any point and they're interested in learning about my series, like kind of explaining a little bit in the first episode, but also going to my website, thegriefgirly.com. They're going to the grief myth page. You'll be able to kind of read a little bit about the series, but something I like about this series is that it's helpful for you, whether you're grieving or whether you're supporting a griever, or you're in a position like to support others, like a teacher, a nurse, HR professional, just getting better about understanding grief for ourselves. And like I said, the first episode, I did not think I had grief myths before my own grief journey, but I definitely was wrong about that. And if you're a griever, I don't want you to be intimidated by this. This is really self-paced. Go quickly or slowly as you want, jump around in the series. You can come back to it as many times as you want. Like, it's yours to have. So I just wanted to be a good resource for people because these grief myths are out there and they're sneaky and they trip us up. And so I really want to help people feel better.
Yeah, seriously, you guys, she's made it so easy. It's really accessible. It's really affordable too. I know getting just even some grief help can feel overwhelming. It can feel out of reach financially, whatever, for people sometimes. So if you are just needing a little extra help, but just need to kind of take a beat and do it at your own pace. Like Shay said, this is like a literally perfect resource. So, but I love this little series we're doing. We're touching on these a little bit. They're all a little bit high level, of course, apply our conversations today to however it applies to you or a loved one who could use it. But yeah, I think these are all really important topics to chat about. So yeah, we can get into the first one. And so this one, man, this is such a hard one. I can understand this one too. So myth number one for this episode is I need to be strong for my family.
Yeah. So
That's such a tough one, especially now, like being a new mom myself. I'm just like, oh man, do I get this? Like more than ever before. So yes, I would love to hear your thoughts on this one.
yeah. Well, being strong doesn't mean that you don't have needs, and getting help isn't a weakness. And so I really want to highlight that. Like you can really like value being there for people and being a great support resource to others while getting help for yourself. Like, and in fact, you're going to be a better resource for them if you can take care of yourself. Like mostly, not most. I mean, this like everyone kind of can deal with this, like it can run the gamut, but parents, this is a really big grief myth that I encounter when I work with parents because they want to be strong for their children. And, absolutely, like you had just talked about, absolutely, I get it. You are feeling responsible for your children and their well-being, but, they are looking to you to see what is okay to do in grief. And they're looking to you to learn how to grieve. So if you are really avoidant because you feel like you have to be strong and like muster through this, then they're going to learn that like emotions are scary and not something we need to turn towards and face. And so you can be strong while crying. You can be saying like, I really miss daddy, and having like a cry, and then feeling those feelings and saying, you know what, like, I think I need to pull out that photo album we made together and I want to look at some pictures. And then you can like cuddle together, laugh, cry, do all the things. And it's not a weakness to show your emotions.
Yeah, I love that so much. This is so cliche what I'm gonna say, but I know you can like empathize with this analogy. It's that classic, like you got to put your own oxygen mask on the plane before putting it on anybody else, be it a kid, whoever it is. Like if you are not cool and if you are not okay or whatever, like you want to show up as well as you can for somebody. That's really hard to do without that metaphorical oxygen or literal oxygen too, I guess. Yeah, it's the nature of the beast. And it's so hard because like, and it's, I think people think they're being really like selfless if they're, putting others' needs before their own and all of that. But like, I think the way that you started off addressing this topic, I think is beautiful. Like, especially with children, but however your family unit look, whatever you feel like you need to be strong for, going to work, I guess, whatever it is, like that is going to be reflected in the people around you. And especially with children, of course, they're so impressionable, of course, depending on their age or whatever, it's like, it affects more than just you, right? Like,
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't have children, but I felt this a lot when after my dad died. My mom had ovarian cancer and like she wasn't well. She never got better. It just kept getting worse. And so I kind of had this pressure on myself that I couldn't really grieve my dad because my mom was going through such hell. So I needed to be strong for her. But like, what did that even mean? Like, she didn't need me to not feel sad that my dad died. And in fact, like it can kind of create a barrier between you and the other people you're trying to be strong for, instead of like creating some closeness and like being vulnerable and being open with each other. So that's really what I hope for people who feel the need to be strong for their family, that they can be strong by starting the conversation.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. And that's a hard conversation to have. Like, I totally get that. And especially, I mean, you just hit on like, your mom being sick while like after, same thing with me, just opposite, right? Mom died, dad was still really sick. And then like, I kind of, it was like this push pull of like, okay, I need to be strong for him. Like now, oh my God, I see he's declining. Like I need to, of course, be strong for him, show up for him, whatever. So let me put my grief for my mom on the back burner, which only hit me harder when they both died. So that was really fun. But I was also, I think there's this element of like, I need to be strong for myself. I am
Mm,
hanging on by a thread here. I still have to work. I still have a relationship, which, well, that also suffered, like that's a
yeah.
really grief. Like I still have a dog to take care of, like, and so
Mm,
whether it's, yeah, like I said, like whether it's your family member, whether it's a
mm,
child, whoever it is that you feel like you need to be strong and show up
mm,
for, all valid, totally understandable. But like, we and you can maybe elaborate on this a little bit. We cannot always be in that like living, hanging on by a thread feeling. Like I understand how it happens, but that is a really sketchy place to be, just mentally, physically,
mhm.
to be so aware of that. And I feel like that is so hard to be aware of in the moment too.
Yeah,
Like
it
don't even,
is so hard.
it's such a fight, flight, or freeze.
Mhm,
Glad I said
mhm,
that. I was
mhm,
mix those up. That's such a human response, I think, to things like that going on, the chaos or the trauma of, whatever you're going through. So like, again, understandable for anybody, out there
mhm,
listening or going through this or have, but like, not, in my experience, not sustainable long
mhm.
term. So it's just something we have to be
Right.
like hyper aware of, which is hard when you got a lot going on.
It
Like,
is so hard. And that's why it's nice to have like an outside perspective, like maybe a grief professional helping you. And you think about it like this is something your listeners can maybe ask themselves, like, if I'm going to be a strong runner, I need to have rest days. Like I'm not going to push my body
yeah.
every single day. So if I'm going to be a strong griever, I need to have blank.
Yep.
Ask yourself that. Come up with 10 different answers and try them all. And you can find your version of that. Like, if I'm going to be a strong griever, being strong doesn't mean not feeling. Being strong means taking care of myself. Like the runner needs the rest day, the griever needs the what? Fill in the blank, come up with 10, and then start trying them. And then you'll start to know more about like what you need. And if you value showing up for people, great. That's amazing. But make sure you're taking your rest days,
Yeah, that's
metaphorically.
such great. Yeah, I was gonna say that's such like a great like analogy or whatever. Cause I mean, and if you think about it, like to use that runner, so if they were to overdo it or if
Yeah.
they overexert themselves, or you get injured, you make
Yeah.
it worse.
You make
Like,
it worse.
and then you're in this
Yeah.
vicious cycle. Who wants
Mm,
that? Like,
yeah,
you know?
yeah, yeah. So like, yeah, I understand that some people really do find a lot of value in showing up for others. I, I don't know if I showed up for anyone, to be honest, during my grief, but I did feel pressure to be okay because my mom was going through so much. But
Yeah.
I did need to make sure that I was taking care of myself.
Yeah. And there's a lot of guilt around that. I feel like some
Mhm.
people can really like I won't even get into this, but there were definitely times where I felt
Mm,
guilt that I felt
yeah,
like I wasn't showing up for my dad in the right way or whatever.
yeah,
But like, I think I knew this in the moment too, but I definitely knew it later on. And actually, that goes for my mom as well. Like, I was doing the best I could.
yeah,
And that
yeah,
doesn't, our best doesn't always feel like enough in
yeah,
those moments. But like,
yeah.
we just have to, like, and that's where I think it's important. Just keep checking in with ourselves. If we know that we really are trying and even if it doesn't feel like it, like we
Mhm,
are kind of maxing out, that is doing what you can in the
mhm,
moment. And if you can, in my opinion, this is how I feel about my grief journey. Like if I could look back and be like, you know what, I was really doing the best I could at the time.
mhm,
Like what more, that's where
yeah,
I always say, like, give yourself grace. Like that we have to, and we need to,
mhm,
I'm not
mhm,
saying, stop feeling guilty. I mean, I know that's
mhm.
guilt and regret and stuff. That is a hard thing to let go of.
Yeah.
Um, but I don't know. I feel like those two things kind of come a lot with the I need to be strong
Mhm.
feelings and things like that.
Good
Like
point.
we feel like guilty for resting, for
Mhm,
taking, but it's like
mhm,
I
mhm,
wish I could expound on that, but it's like just no, like you
mhm,
just don't. Like
mhm, mhm.
it's okay.
Yeah. Like
Realistic.
I say this to people a lot, like, how are you supposed to know how to grieve your mom? Like, when have you had practice in your life with that? Like, how are you supposed to know how to grieve this person, this loss? So it is really hard.
Like,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Mhm,
And
mhm,
honestly, even if you go through like, of course you kind of in theory only have like one of each parent, but let's say there's like, you're kind of maybe grieving a job or something, or there's like, some other secondary,
mhm.
it's just a different form of loss where you can maybe go through it different times or different
Yeah.
chapters, different phases or ending of a
Mhm,
romantic relationship, maybe,
mhm,
if it's a different person, it's a different situation, you grieve it differently each time. So even though you might have been like, oh, I've been down this road already, but it feels totally different or whatever, like that's
mhm.
okay. Like, because the
Okay.
circumstances are different. Yeah. So it's just,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
I think we gave away some of our tips for the last one on this episode.
Yeah.
All grief is the same.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I
Yeah.
kind of had a little bit. Okay. I'll zip my lip on that
No,
one.
you're good. You're good. I just love how these are just like this big web. Like I said, the first episode, like this one's a cousin to this one. They all
Yeah.
just, as I was creating this, I was like, oh, and this and this. And I was like, okay, stop. Like, don't do 15 grief myths.
Let's just start here. And then, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. They kind of have this like domino effect. But
They're
yeah,
all-
like being strong can totally be a value of yours, but like make sure you're having your rest days and just maybe like question yourself and challenge, what does strong mean?
Mhm.
Does it mean avoidant? Does it mean tough? Does it mean emotionless? Or like, does it mean vulnerable? Does it mean open? Does it mean honest? Like it can
Yeah.
mean a lot of different things. And I think the thing that I see people when they get tripped up by this one is that like being strong means like I have to be okay all the time. And
Yes.
there's no like room for me or grace for me to have a hard moment. And that's just unrealistic, really
Yeah,
unrealistic.
it is definitely. Yeah. All right. Well said.
Mm.
So this next one, I kind of maybe touched on this a little bit in a previous episode where this was something that was imposed on me. Myth is the first year is the hardest.
Yeah, the first year is survival, autopilot. I hate even saying year because, like everyone's grief is so different and unique. But to simplify it, to speak about it generally, the first year there's a lot to do when someone dies. There's a lot of like practical things. There's a lot of changes. Someone said to me like a cog in the machine is missing. I'm like, yeah, well, the machine doesn't work the same way anymore. So like we have to rearrange our family, our life, and just so much changes. So a lot of times the first year is on autopilot or survival. But if we think and we hear from other people, the first year is the hardest, and we get into year two and we're having a hard time, we can feel a lot of guilt and shame. But really, it's like just throw the timeline out about this is the first year and I need to be okay by year two. Like as soon as the calendar is on year two, I need to be great. That's just too much pressure. You don't need to feel anything at any point. And back to like year two and three were really hard. And so it's helpful to kind of know that. I think for new grievers, people at the early, beginnings of loss who haven't experienced loss before, like it's helpful to know that the first year is just sort of a fog and a blur. And you don't need to be okay at the end of that first year, first 6 months, first 2 years, whatever it is for you.
Yeah.
What do you think?
A lot of this too, for like holidays and anniversaries and things like that comes up for me too, which I see a lot of I see a lot of comments on this on like Instagram and stuff where people will be like, oh, it's like the first anniversary, I'm dreading it, first Christmas, first Hanukkah, Easter, whatever holiday was. And again, that is not to say that the smaller, quieter daily moments aren't intense too. They are for sure. But just to address like those firsts, if you will, first birthdays without them, whatever. And again, this is very much talking about the death of a loved one, but this could be anything, it's like if you maybe went through a divorce and it would have been your, I don't know,
Definitely.
fill in the blank. And sure, of course, like there is a rawness to the whole first year. There's a rawness to those firsts, if you will. But I want us all to be comfortable leaving space for like the rawness in other years too. Or like, we've talked about this in another episode too, kind of where, if you're in a different phase of life, maybe and I kind of mentioned these things from experience, like this is the first year where you're married and then going through XYZ holiday without them or something, I'm making this up, but like, or it's the first whatever Christmas where you now have a kid or something, I'm thinking again, this is my first year without my parents now, stuff coming up. But and that evolves and shifts each year too. Some years might be easier than you expected. And that's another thing too that I guess I'll say I'll caution against, but I also don't want this to be so like cut and dry. We can put a lot of pressure on like holidays or these big events, whatever, and almost kind of psych ourselves up.
Yeah.
And I don't want to say like make them worse for ourselves, but I've seen that happen and I've also done it myself. So that is not to negate these holidays. It's not to I'm not saying any of this to mitigate it. It's funny though. I've talked to other people in the grief space where we've kind of like messaged each other, whatever. I'm like, we might check in with each other like, oh, how was it for you? And they were like, honestly, the day itself actually wasn't that bad. like, it was actually a really beautiful day. I honored my parents this way or whatever. It was actually the lead up that was the worst part of it. It was just like the overall season, for example, was kind of tough, but like the actual day was, I'm not going to say like it was just like any other day, but it was, it is what it was, right? So I don't know. So I get it's that whole first year thing is really fun. I don't know where that even came from. Like who came up with this too, by the way, like this
I
first
don't know. I wish I knew.
so I'm like, there's like this rawness, I guess you could feel, but I guess
Yeah.
it's also like leave space for that could happen at any other point 20 years down the line too. You kind of,
Yeah. And there's
yeah,
no shame,
brush
right?
her
Like
off
that's,
to
yeah,
feel
that's,
any
it's
type of way.
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like, okay, that like 5 years or like year five was really hard at your birthday. Like, that's okay. You
Yeah.
don't need to
The
be over it.
could change too. Like I always think of there's this sweet girl and that I've kind of met through my community and she
Mhm.
like whereas some maybe not even just holidays, but like, oh, actually she had a situation where like she moved to a different state and it was moving away from where her mom was buried. And
Mhm.
so like not only was that hard, but then all of the like the daily things, of course, but that like maybe not even being able to go like physically visit her. But then like all of the holidays felt kind of especially crazy. And it was like past her first year, but that was hard because she wasn't spending it where she normally would have, or in a place where she could go visit her mom that morning and then go see family. She was in a totally different place. So, like, just to validate, there's like so many different iterations of this. And this, again, it's just to get the point home like, this, any of this stuff could happen any day, anytime. Like, not to,
Mhm.
make that sound like exhausting and horrible. Like, oh, great. So this could literally hit me at any point. I mean, yeah, kind of, but that's why finding ways to cope with
Mhm.
it is so important, however that works.
Yeah. Yeah. Like you kind of mentioned a few times, like big change, like the person you met in your community who moved away, like your daughter being born, like this is the first year that I'm married at the holidays without my parents. So like big changes can like, stir up the grief. And when it does, I just am like curious about it. Okay, like my grief needs something, it needs some attention. Let me move towards it. Let me try to be curious instead of that build up and psyching myself out before it happens. Like, of course, easier said than done. Like, my dad died in March, and I don't know when you're gonna put this out, but this is March when we're recording it, and I'm like, oh God, here I go, here we come. Like the trees are blooming, and I just can feel this like heaviness, but it just is a sign that I need to spend some time with my grief, and that's okay. And it's been years, but like it's so representative of this big change in my life because he was the first one of my three family members who died. It's almost like okay, you just need to have some space, and that doesn't mean you're going backwards. That doesn't mean that you're doing it wrong. That doesn't mean you can't be a grief coach and therapist, that you're a fraud. Like it's just that your grief needs some attention. So
Yeah.
honor it and spend time with it. And like I'm always glad that I do. It makes me feel so much better because like I get to, in a way, spend time with him.
Yes, I was just gonna say, like, I almost think it makes you feel in a weird, twisted, somehow
Yeah.
effective but ineffective way of feeling closer to them. And especially like
Yeah.
the further you move away from
Mhm.
like, especially someone that you've lost, like I've been feeling this way in the 3 to 4 years after losing my parents, like that's a really trippy place to be in because it's like you feel like it's just yesterday, it's like just close
Yeah.
enough, but now it's actually getting further away. And that's like kind of that's an unsettling place to be in.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And at the same time, I also think it's like special that like I have this like connection. Other people like of course they know my dad died and like if I wanted to talk about it or bring it up to them, they would like talk to me, but it's not the same as like the first or second year when you're getting a text like, oh, like this, I know this day is hard for you. Not to say people don't text me. Like it's just that the reality is the support does like drop off in that sense, but it's like mine, like my grief to have and like my connection with him and my family and something that years later still pulls at me. So it's almost like those days that I was worried I would forget, like those seem laughable now.
Yeah, seriously. It's yeah, there's ways that we can bring ourselves closer to them a little bit, ways to I know this sounds so cliche, but ways to honor them and just to, you know, whether it's your first year or year five or your, what's that? I'm paraphrasing this quote, but I've seen this kind of around in the group space on Instagram. It's like, our love never dies. So our like kind of like our grief never dies either. So
Mhm.
like, they
Mhm.
sort of go hand in hand. Like it's that
Mhm.
whole like we grieve because we love sort of thing. Well,
Mhm.
our love for this person doesn't go away. It's going to, well, I don't want to say the love is going to evolve. The love's always going to be there, right?
Yeah.
But our relationship with them now is going to continue to evolve and it's going to look different, unfortunately, even though we didn't ask for that to happen. That is the circumstances in front of us.
Mhm.
So,
Mhm.
it's just kind of a testament to like, well, what can you make of it? And not to overthink that, not to put pressure on
Yeah.
ourselves to like make it some big thing or whatever, but like, there are some years where something will come up and I'll do a little something to, it feels right to honor my parents in some way or whatever. And then there are some years when I'm like, oh my, I just don't want to acknowledge this.
Yeah.
Like it's not today. And
Yeah.
like, I'm
Yeah.
not feeling guilt over that.
Mhm.
I kind of want to like, let their birthday pass a little bit.
Yeah.
And just because I'm
Mhm.
really feeling it heavily that like, at the end of the day, like, I'm not gonna say they're just days and not to like negate just the daily day-to-day thing being hard, but like, you know, and I'm going off on a tangent here, but I truly feel this like when we die, like space and time and all of that, it means something totally different. So the things that we associate with like certain days or whatever, they're
Mhm.
important. Like, I'm not saying to like ignore those things, but like just keeping that in mind. If you are thinking about your loved one all the time, all day, every day, like it's okay
Yeah.
to take breaks, I guess, if you will,
Oh
too.
yeah.
You
Yeah.
know what I mean? So, like
Mhm.
I said, whether it's the first year, because I know people, they're just like, I just want freaking Thanksgiving to be over with. I could
Yeah.
not less,
Sure.
whatever. It's like, okay,
That's
that's
fine.
what you need to
Yeah.
do.
Mhm.
I'm not gonna go into saying like this is one of the myths and be like, your loved one would be okay with that. It's fine. I'm not gonna
Yeah.
go put words in people's mouths, but it's just like we have to allow that sometimes. Like I've had to do that to keep my sanity around some of
Mhm.
those bigger holidays and then just some of the day-to-day stuff too. And
Mhm.
that's okay.
Mhm. Yes, absolutely. It's just all about like giving yourself a lot of like grace and room and
Yeah.
forgiveness and understanding like you would to a friend.
Hey, my friend, are you needing some relief from your grief? If so, I have an exciting new offering that will help you get exactly that. My 14-day Relief in Your Grief challenge brings you powerful, impactful, bite-sized daily content alongside the perfect meditation. One of the biggest struggles I hear from my members, clients, and people on social media is that they just need some relief from the stress, sadness, and pain that grief and loss can cause. But here's the thing, so many people are lost and unsure about where to start. This can feel like a huge thing to tackle, so we are doing it together and we're starting with just 14 days. Give me 2 weeks and I will help you begin to take that anxiety, heartache, and anguish and turn it into peace, clarity, and hope as you move forward with your grief. Seriously, what do you have to lose by joining? Challenge your grief and give yourself some relief, my friend. I have no doubt this 14 days will be an inspiring, uplifting, perspective changing experience for you. Join now through the link in the show description. Well, so this last one, and by the way, in this episode, we're only doing 3 today, but this is a big one. It's one we've kind of given away multiple times, but all grief is the same is myth number 3 here. So
Yeah.
we've kind
Yeah.
of spelled this one a little bit, but I would love to hear what more you have to say about this one specifically.
Yeah, like I think this one can personally, I'll just talk about like my experience a little bit for a moment. Like I really thought I my dad died and I was like, I understand what my grief is going to be like now that my sister has died and now that my mom has died. But really it was so different. Each grief showed up differently because I'm grieving this relationship, like this person, how I related to them. And there's so many factors and that involve like who died? Who were they to you? How did they die? Were you there? Did you get to be with, like, there's just all these different factors that, inform our grief. And so my dad's death was sudden while my mom was sick, and it was traumatic in the sense that I was there and it was very scary. And in some ways, I was so glad that I was there because then when my sister died, I wasn't there. And so that was so horrible. And so And then my mom died and we knew she was dying and I was there. So all of those are different like flavors, if you will.
Circumstances of
Yeah,
like, yeah,
circumstances. Not flavors,
flavors, I like that
circumstances.
better.
So that my grief was going to have a different emotional experience. And so I think that kind of surprised me a little bit. And so I think that's like something for people to keep in mind that yes, you may have experienced a loss before, but your loss before is going to be different than this one now, or your loss is going to be different than the person that you're supporting who's going through loss. Like, I think one of the reasons I added this one is because I had a lot of people who'd experienced loss tell me they knew exactly how I was feeling. And of course, I wanted to scream at them
I
and then
had
maybe
$1 for every time. Oh my
yeah.
God.
Yeah. So this is like I said, this course also like helps people support grievers and educate ourselves. Like they are grieving their unique experience. And so it's important to, if you want to be an ally with them, you can talk to them about like, let me understand your grief, like ask them questions, like be curious. I think
Yes.
it really pissed me off when people, told me that they understood and they had never asked me how I was feeling and
Yeah.
or curious to actually understand.
Yeah, I love that. I feel like this is like the theme of today's episode is like curiosity and getting
Hmm.
curious about grief. I don't think people like understand like think about that sometimes. Like they're like getting curious about my grief. Like what? Like what does that even mean? And we've touched on it, but I think, and I think journaling is a huge part of it. Like I definitely that has been a massive tool for me. I created the journal that I have for a reason. Like it's yeah, it's super impactful. And it's so interesting too. You never know what's going to come up for you.
Yeah.
One thing I actually love doing, I'm totally sidebarring here for a second, but like I know some people like maybe aren't into writing or whatever. What I find really interesting is like, so let's say we have like journal prompts in front of us, speaking out the answer to,
Mhm.
I find really interesting. I've done that before, and it's really interesting what kind of just like flows from you when you are just unapologetically like sharing your thoughts. And it's not like you have to share them with anybody. This could be like on a voice note, on your phone or something like that, or literally, I guess, just say it out loud to yourself. You don't have to record it, but like, it's really humbling when you can ask yourself those tough questions. But I think that's also why, sometimes like with grievers, like I certainly can, say this in my earlier grief, I wouldn't have known what to ask myself. Like, you don't
Yeah.
even know where to start. So I think that is another reason that like getting help from a professional or like what you're offering or like what I have with my membership or whatever, like it kind of guides you along a little bit if you kind of don't know where to start. Because I think another aspect too that's really important to keep in mind with like this, all grief is the same thing and like how some people will sort of impose that on us is like one thing I've said before, I'm curious your thoughts on this is like the thing too is we're all raised so differently. We're
Yeah.
all we touched on this, I think it was in previous one of these, but like we are the way that we are shown grief, actually we said this earlier, right? Like how we see our parents grieve or not, right? Like they either grieve openly or they push it down or whatever iteration in between. How we are like taught to grieve or not and how accepted it is or not and all of these things. So I always try and keep that in mind too. If anybody, especially if they come in with that, oh, I totally understand how you're feeling. And you're just like, you have no freaking idea how I'm feeling. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Like, and again, some people can say these things out of whether it's love or they're just trying to be like, you're not alone. It's all good. And you're just like, I've actually never felt more alone in my life, but it's fine. Like they might say these things or they might offer help or not offer help or react in a certain way because of their sort of, I'll say, conditioning around grief. So I think that's just another thing too, just as a griever, that's sometimes good to keep in mind. And that's hard to keep in mind in the moment. You know what
It's
I
so
mean? You might
hard.
get frustrated with people and and
Yeah.
not to add to the list of things that grievers need to keep in mind today, but it's just something to like reflect on. And
Yeah.
sometimes what I've found and what I've had to sort of be like, find a little bit of acceptance around is like, okay, if someone is trying to tell me something or they have some opinion or whatever, or they are grieving a certain way that doesn't align with how I am grieving, is like, okay, that is more about them than it is about
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
and honoring myself and my journey and staying in my lane with
Hmm.
it. Yeah, I think that's just, just important to just remember everyone,
Hmm.
especially
Absolutely.
pressure from wherever we're feeling it. Like,
Yeah. I love what you said about like speaking out loud, like recording yourself or just saying it out loud. That's something I have my clients do a lot is say things out loud and say things out loud in different voices too, because
Yeah.
it'll help you. Like I don't need when you are really upset about something and like we're not going to come in with logic and like change it. Like if you're saying like it's my fault that my mom died, of course it's like not their fault. Like I understand that this is like this guilt feeling that they're like dealing with. And I'm like, they'll like they're feeling guilty and I'm like, say the sentence in your head out loud. Okay, now say it out loud like an old grandpa would say it. And we don't need to change the words, but I want you to see it differently. Like I want you to kind of have a different perspective with it. And so it can help you kind of find some compassion and like soften the edges a little bit. I don't need you to change this thought completely or change these feelings. I'm just trying to help you see them differently because then that way you're not so stuck with it. And so I think speaking out loud, some of these things can be really helpful, like speaking these myths out loud, even to like help you see like, okay, is this something I really like feel like triggered by when I say it out loud? Interesting. Let me play with that a little bit and get into that and see what's going on there. And asking yourself like, okay, I know the answers to these questions, but there's something about saying it out loud, writing it down. Who died? My dad. How did he die? He had a heart attack when I was there. What was our relationship like? We were so close. What are the other contexts? My mom was sick. Like helping you externalize some of this will kind of help you see like, okay, this is his own unique situation and it needs a special kind of support.
Yeah. Oh my God, I love that. Like, and that's so funny. I mean, who would think to do an exercise like that where some of these things are so obvious and and it also could be painful to relive. It's like, oh my God, I don't want to talk about my dad dying again. You know what I
Yeah.
mean?
Yeah.
But that is where I'm gonna say some growth in our grief can come from. It's like what you said. Like, I think this is such a beautiful takeaway for today's episode is like that curiosity
Hmm.
and just a shift in perspective. It's not like we can't change some of these thoughts that we're having overnight, nor should we, nor
Yeah.
is that the
Right.
goal, right? It's
Right.
just to
Hmm.
understand them, understand where they're coming from, not judging ourselves for it. And so exercises like that are like such a beautiful way to do that. And yeah, I encourage people to get curious about their grief because there's so many. I'm thinking of a couple of people that I've worked with on this where they'll be kind of like I don't want to say confused, but they're kind of like trying to understand why they're grieving one person one way or this person another
Hmm.
way. Or in fact, I know someone who they were feeling guilty that they were like harping more
Hmm.
on the death of their mom than they were on their dad. And so
Hmm.
when we dug into that, we were kind of asking some similar questions. And it was more like around the context. It's like, okay, well, what was going on at the
Yeah.
time? Or what was the circumstances around one versus another? And
Hmm.
it's a very similar story to
Hmm.
yours, actually. She did get to say bye to her dad. It was a very fast decline with his health, but she did at least get to say goodbye. She was there. She had
Hmm.
like a little bit of time to process it. But
Hmm.
then I think maybe a week or something later, it's a very, very short time later, her mom died very suddenly. She wasn't there, couldn't help or
Hmm.
whatever. And she was like, I feel guilty for like
Yeah.
grieving my mom's, like, I feel like I'm grieving her more than my dad, but I love my dad. Like, I don't want to feel like I'm
Hmm.
grieving him less. I'm like, you're probably not like there, but let's think about that, get curious,
Hmm.
dig into
Hmm.
why some of these things might be coming up. And it's okay that if you are going through more than one loss, that looks different. I went through the same thing, like when my dad, well, was declining, but I think he had died. But then my now husband and I had broken up and for like a short time. And I almost found myself more hung up on that.
Oh yeah.
I did my dad's death, which is going to sound so like, not that I
That's so
wasn't,
common though.
like, let's be real, like my dad's death was devastating. And then
Yeah.
I was both parents at the same time. But at the same time, I was like, well, but he had had cancer for 6 years. I knew he
Yeah.
was downhill soon
Yeah.
after my mom died. There was like, whether or not I realized
Hmm.
it, I think I was already processing that. I was
Yeah. You
for
were.
sure had anticipatory grief. I was grieving
Yeah.
him before he was even gone.
Yeah.
Whereas with my husband, I was like at the time, well, we did end up getting married, but I thought I was going to marry him, and it
Hmm.
was like a living loss. Like he was
Hmm.
working 10 minutes away, and I was like,
Hmm.
how am I supposed to, you know what I mean? And it was just on top of everything else. So I was
Hmm.
like, I can't bring my parents back, but like this relationship is, or it was still very much alive. So like, you know what I mean? And so I don't want people also feeling guilt around things like
Hmm.
that. Like that was even hard for me to say out loud just then.
I'm
Like,
so glad you said that. That's so common. Like as
yeah.
soon as you started saying that, I was like, yes, because I experienced that personally and like with other people all the time. anything but the death that our brain can latch on to is what it's going to latch on to. And
Yeah.
any like living relationship that isn't going 100% perfectly, our brain is going to be like, we're going to put our attention there and we're going to deal with that. And that's going to be your quote unquote obsession, your boss, your ex, your friend who's not doing the things the right way. That is what our brain would much rather deal with than the relationship that is quote unquote over. Because
Yeah.
a brain can't do anything about that,
Absolutely.
but our brain can play those last conversations with that person over and over again. And when am I going to see them next? What am I going to say? And how am I going to fix this? And it's so much more comfortable for our brains to do that. And so it's very common for people to come to me, need to work on a grief, and we end up talking about their mother-in-law. That's
Yeah.
fine. We'll
For
talk
real.
about her. Yeah.
That's exactly what happened in therapy too, when I was in it for several months. And I expressed to her too, I was like, I feel kind of weird about this. Like, I feel kind of guilty about it. I'm just like, what is this about? And she kind of said something
Mm-hmm.
similar. So, and it's just, not, I know how slimy that can feel. I know how weird that can feel, but the way that you just described it, I think is so perfect. Like, it is, oh my God. It's again, we're doing a little bit of this fight or flight kind of thing
Mm-hmm.
going on. So her
Mm-hmm.
brain is trying to make sense of everything going on
Yeah.
around us. So it makes
Yeah.
sense that like a living thing that we still in theory have some control over. Cause that's another thing
Yes.
definitely struggled with, was like
Mm-hmm.
so much of my life felt so out of
Yeah.
control for so long.
Yeah.
And that finally kind of died with my dad, because that was officially out of my control now, but
Mm-hmm.
like permanently. And so
Mm-hmm.
now it was like, I felt like it was sort of reaching for anything else I could get my
Yeah.
hands on.
And we're
Like,
wired for connection, and you just had these two big losses. So then like you've got to fix this other like connection that has been broken, or you've got to like figure out how to not have more losses in your life. And so your brain, you have to remember that we all have to remember, myself included, that we are wired for connection and survival. And all these things that we do are about connection and survival, including avoiding our grief and,
mhm.
obsessing over these other relationships, because the brain's like, oh, that was painful. We just lost two people. Well, we are not going to do that again. We're going to figure this out with him.
Yeah, yeah. It's when you think about it that way, you're just like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. But in the
Mhm.
moment, and when you are
Yeah.
like in the midst of it all, that's hard, right? It's like, again,
Hmm.
hindsight's 2020 on some of these things. But that's why
Hmm.
I'm hoping, talking about some of these grief myths,
Yes.
discussing some of these things, we can maybe help catch people in
Yeah.
these thoughts as they're happening, or wherever we catch you with these episodes, or
Hmm.
wherever you're at. Just knowing that some of these things are very normal, they're very
Hmm.
painful to talk about. There's a lot of shame around some of these things. And it's not that, like, and again, the expectation here is not that our thoughts on this change overnight, but that's why I love this little mini series we're doing so much, and what you've put together, because it's just taking baby steps to understand it, to cope with it a little bit better, to give ourselves some patience, because I think that's a whole nother thing. What the brain is trying to do is we're grieving, and that's, like, we got a lot going on. So like to have these open and very like vulnerable and candid conversations, I think is like it's awesome. It's so needed. So yeah, I think that's a beautiful place to end it. But I want to hand it, any closing thoughts you have on any of the things that we talked about today.
Yeah, I think you said it so well. Grief is so tricky and complex, and a lot of people don't have grief literacy. So going to others, and like you wouldn't feel comfortable saying, like, I'm really thinking more about my ex than my parents, but that's why we need to talk about these things and change that grief literacy, because that is a very normal experience. But if there isn't someone in your life that you feel comfortable going to, then you can get support. I love debunking grief myths. It is like so satisfying for me. Yeah, and helping people feel less alone, and to externalizing things and see it in a different perspective. So I hope this was helpful for people. And I hope that regardless of like, you can find some grace and kindness and just patience with yourself, like you said.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I have no doubt what we talked about today hopefully opened some doors or had some aha moments for someone out there. The more I talk about grief, and I'm like in this space a lot, there are still conversations like this where I'll be like, oh my God, like even
Mhm.
just in the few that we've had so far, I'm like, whoa, so there
Yeah.
it is a continuous learning, growing realization process. So I think, like I said, today it was a lot about like getting curious, a lot of reflection, a lot of like perspective. So just encouraging anyone out there listening today to like, just try that if you haven't already. Like, just, yeah, get to kind of know yourself again. That it's unfortunately, it's a beautiful process. Unfortunately, it can sometimes take a big or even a small loss to,
Yeah.
to dig into that. But, and I know it's hard and it's emotionally taxing at times, but it's really profound and it's also really cathartic, I think, when we do start to get into it and we can have open conversations like this. So I am super grateful for you and everything that you put together with this. I really hope people check it out. Like I mentioned, like all of this is linked in the show notes and where you can find Shay on social media and all the good things. But amazing conversations today, as always. So thank you so much, Shay, for being here and sharing your wisdom with us, as always.
Thank you so much. This was awesome.
I am sending you a huge thank you for tuning into today's episode, my friend. I'm so grateful you're here and for the steps you are taking to heal your heart, open your mind, fulfill your soul, learn, grow, and evolve, and move through this crazy thing called life in big, beautiful, impactful ways. Visit lossesbecomegains.com for my blog, ways to work with me, to shop my daily journal, and so much more. And be sure you're following along on Instagram and Facebook at Life with Grief Podcast. I love seeing new faces, meeting new people, hearing your stories, and supporting you however I can. Be sure to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. If you haven't left a rating or a review, please do so. I would so appreciate it. Or if you feel so inclined to share this episode or this podcast with someone who could use it too. I'll catch you in the next episode.